How about another round of applause for our cellist, Lily Anawasco? All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Arlington Heights Memorial Library. My name is Mike Driscoll. I am the Executive Director of your library. And on behalf of the Board of Library Trustees and the library staff, I'd like to welcome you to our 2024 One Book, One Village author event. Your presence here tonight, whether it be physically in this room or virtually on the live stream, demonstrates that after 11 years of One Book, One Village, the library continues to successfully bring our community together in the shared experience of reading the same book at the same time. We've received an overwhelmingly positive response from the community for this year's One Book, One Village selection, The Collected Regrets of Clover by Mikki Brammer. We've increased the number of electronic book copies by more than double to meet this high demand. Our physical copies of the book were checked out at a record speed. Tonight's author event has had a wait list since the early days of September, and the programs and book discussions were also very well attended. I highly encourage you to explore the interactive exhibits and displays created for this year's initiative. Visit the Butterfly Garden outside the library and try the Wind Phone, which is a Japanese concept for one-way conversations with deceased loved ones. On the first floor, you'll find handmade books by a local artist that welcomes you to share your confessions, regrets, and advice, and are reminiscent of Clover's journals. A beautiful ofrenda by local artists is also on display on the first floor ahead of our Dia de los Muertos celebration on Saturday, November 2nd. Believe it or not, the One Book, One Village initiative actually takes a village to bring to life. Everything from selecting the book to organizing the programs to representing the library in the community. This initiative would not be as successful and impactful without the hard work and dedication of our amazing library staff. So I want to say thank you to Team AHML. I would also like to thank our friends of the library for their continued sponsorship of One Book, One Village, our community partner, Willow House, as well as the Bookstall for providing books for sale at tonight's event. Can we please give all of them another nice round of applause? And in continuing with the library's commitment to providing accessible experiences, we are pleased to offer an ASL interpreter for tonight's event. I would now like to welcome Rebecca James, who will be moderating tonight's conversation. James is a certified life cycle celebrant, caregiver, and Death Cafe facilitator. She has been the facilitator of the library's Death Cafes since 2019, when the library first introduced the concept of death-positive conversations to Arlington Heights. We are also thrilled to welcome our featured guest, the author of The Collected Regrets of Clover, Mikki Brammer. Brammer is an Australian writer based in New York City. The Collected Regrets of Clover is Brammer's first novel and has so far been published in 26 languages. In addition to fiction, Brammer writes about architecture, art, and design for publications including Architectural Digest, Dwell, and Elle Decor. Please join me in welcoming Mikki Brammer.
Hello and welcome to all of you in the room and everybody watching. Thank you all so much for being here. I know we're all super excited to be spending time with our guest this evening, author Mikki Brammer. Mikki has put something out into the world that is not only a beautifully crafted story, but helps us recognize our commonality. We are all connected by and in our human experience, and we're going to have one of those tonight. The Collected Regrets of Clover has been quite popular and I would say meaningful to the Arlington Heights library community. The story of Clover, the protagonist, learning how to navigate the world outside her own safe spaces and against a backdrop of death and grief in her own life. But ultimately, a story about love and life, I think has sparked many rich conversations in the community around your book. So prior to the novel, you wrote mostly journalistic and article-length pieces, and you decided to take on a longer work about a subject that you had some anxiety around initially. I know you made a conscious decision to become more curious about death and moved toward the subject as opposed to retreating from it. So, was there any specific event that began your quest in this area, or was it more of a tension about like the topic is, the tension's becoming too great and I just kind of finally want to address it for your own reasons? What was the catalyst?
So I'd had a fear of death since I was a kid. When I was very small, there was quite a bit of death in my family. And so I was aware of it quite early, and I don't think I ever really processed that. And so I'd carried this fear through my life. And then I got to my 30s, and I was living in New York. And as a person, I'm someone who, when I'm scared of something, I make myself do it until I'm not scared of it anymore. So I thought, well, the biggest fear is death. So maybe instead of avoiding every single thing about it, I wouldn't read anything or listen to anything, maybe I could get a little bit curious. And so I challenged myself to essentially immerse myself in it. And in New York, you can go down a lot of rabbit holes, and that was the one I went down. And so I went to a lot of events, talks by doctors and hospice workers, some lectures on Stoicism. The Stoics were really preoccupied with mortality, and death cafes. And then that really helped me because I saw all these people just discussing it so normally. And I thought, well, if this is helping me, maybe I could help other people who have this fear of death and write something that would be palatable to them and present these topics in a way that wasn't morose and depressing, but fun and uplifting. And when I learned about the profession of a death doula, I was just fascinated because it seemed like such a noble thing for someone to do. And I really wondered what would lead someone to choose that path in life. And that's when the seeds of Clover started to form in my brain, and it all went from there.
So during that exploration, you did come across the unique services of end-of-life doulas. Like a birth doula, an end-of-life doula provides non-medical support for those who are facing terminal illness or death, and also provides support to the loved ones. Doulas are very present, as we see in Clover, completely open, emotionally available, and they listen. And this role, I think, has existed in some form kind of for millennia, right? We have spiritual leaders, clergy, and in ancient traditions and current traditions too, the shaman, whose role was to assist the spirit of the dying to make the transition into this, the great continuum in their belief. And I just have to add, I found a term for what they do. It's called psychopomp, P-O-M-P.
Oh.
It's Greek, and it literally means the conductor of souls.
Wow.
Which sounds like a big job.
It does. A lot of pressure.
But I think that's where our doulas kind of come in today. I think we still yearn for some kind of a comfort or connection at the end of life. Can you share a little bit about your exposure to working with death doulas, or were they open to sharing with you what they do?
Yeah, some were. I think it is a very sacred thing to do. And so I think some were very concerned about their clients' privacy and respecting that process. So some were a little reluctant to speak about it, which I completely understood. and others would speak more generally. But I do come from a family of doctors and nurses who have no fear of death, and I think that was part of the problem. They thought it was fine and didn't realize I was over here in the corner worrying about it. But I spoke to them a lot about what it was like to accompany the dying and the different things that happen. And I listened to a lot of interviews, read a lot of books, and just tried to soak in as much as I could. And the conclusion I came to was that there's no one way to be an end-of-life doula. And everybody approaches it in a very unique way. Some people do have a bit more of a medical support side. Some are more experiential and spiritual. Some deal with the logistics. And so it really is their role to interpret, which is true of a lot of professions. And so for Clover, I just thought about all of those things and thought, if I were ever a death doula, how would I approach it? And that's how Clover is.
Could you ever be a death doula?
No, I've thought about it. And I think another thing I really learned from speaking with those people is that it is really a calling. You know, whether you're an end-of-life doula or a hospice worker, a doctor, people are really called to that profession. And it is very sacred to them. And I would say I really admire them, but I don't necessarily feel called to it. I do wish that there was more support for those kinds of people, because they are often volunteers or not very well paid, and they take on a lot and often suffer from burnout. So
I would imagine.
Yes, I really admire the people who do choose that path.
It seems like it takes a tremendous amount of a special kind of energy and strength to hold that space, a sacred space, as you say. Clover is a very clear and, for me, relatable character. She is most comfortable in her own company, uncomfortable with others, and kind of chooses a quiet life and to stay quiet. We do see her grapple with this kind of contrast of contentments. Like, she is in her own sort of isolationist life, but fully she admits that she is one of New York's lonely people. So I'm curious how her character, you had the death doula part, and that was really intriguing for you, but I'm curious how her character around that kind of first developed. Is she, would you say, an amalgam of people that you know, or based on more of a single inspiration? How did kind of the elements of Clover come together for you?
I would say an amalgam. I've lived in New York almost 12 years, and I also lived in Paris and Barcelona, and they're all big cities. And the thing that always struck me was that we're cities of millions of people, but there's millions of lonely people, so we live in each other's pockets, and yet we can't connect. And that was such a sad thing. And then observing during the pandemic, that just got worse. And so I'd also, in working in New York, met a lot of these people who are maybe seen by society as quirky or loners. But if you take the time to chat to them, they're actually very warm and funny and interesting. And it's just that they often have this social anxiety that when the time comes, they freeze up. And no one really takes the time to wait for them to overcome that in a conversation. So they're put in this box. And so I really wanted to explore that and to have a character that acknowledged those people and made them feel seen, but also to prove that, it's if you like a solitary life, that's fine. You know, you shouldn't feel pressured to live an outward life if that's not what you enjoy. But if you are seeking connection, maybe there is a way that you can start to take steps. And I think people often who feel alone and isolated think they have no one, but there's actually always these people on the periphery, as Clover has, that are kind of really looking out for them, expressing love for them, really care for them, and are kind of nudging them out of their shell. But in the end, they have to take the step. There's only so much nudging you can do.
That's right. I mean, as I was reading, I realized that Clover is actually an expert on grief, experientially. When we meet her, I think it's 13 years after Grandpa's death. She's living really inside of his memory, kind of quite literally. in his home. She says she stayed in New York to hold on to him. And then she has the character of Leo, one of these people who care about her. Lost my mic. Hello? Testing. The character of Leo, who lost his wife 50 years ago, and Clover, it feels like, finds solace in that friendship. And I think she says they have their grief could coexist. She also says, it frustrated me that society was so determined to quantify grief as if time could erase the potency of love. Who are we to tell anyone that their pain isn't worthy? It's so lovely how Clover really is also an advocate for grief and the intimate nature of grief. So I was curious in writing her, what did you yourself learn from Clover that maybe you hadn't realized before about grief and holding grief and the whole grieving process?
Yeah, I learned a lot actually from Clover. Specifically how to be with someone who's grieving. I would say I'm a very positive and optimistic person, and so, when someone was hurting or grieving, I would try to cheer them up. And the thing that I learned was that is not usually the best thing to do, and it's not very helpful because you're essentially not leaving space for their grief. And so one of the useful things I learned in the research I did was to ask people, do you want to be hugged, helped, or heard? And their answer might be different depending on the day, but it's really about letting them take the lead. And same with Clover does with her clients who are dying, letting them dictate what their relationship is. So with the first gentleman she's with in the book, she says they've hardly spoken any sentences together, and she understands that, whereas Claudia loves a chat. So it's really allowing them to set the standard of how you're going to interact. And I think really the whole thing about being willing to look someone else's pain in the eye, that was very meaningful to me, and that's something I've tried to really do and not shy away. And I have lost some close friends, but a lot of it came from observing other people grieving and seeing how people would turn away from them, or people would be awkward around them, or they wouldn't, after a certain time, they expected them to be over it, or just the things they would say, like, everything happens for a reason, or they wouldn't want you to be sad, like all the things that you think are helpful but are actually quite unhelpful. That was very eye-opening for me, and I think I learned to be a better person for a friend who is grieving.
And there's no time limit, right?
Exactly.
It doesn't, suddenly you're not over your loss.
No, I don't think you ever get over it. I think it's a sign that you loved someone and you're never going to stop loving them. So unfortunately, that's the price of loving someone.
I love how Clover expressed her thoughts of grief at the end of the story by saying that grief was like dust. When you're kind of in the thick of a dust storm, you can't see and everything is obscured. And then as the storm starts to kind of dissipate, it settles kind of into all the crevices. And she said grief is just love looking for a place to settle, which I thought was just beautiful. So in terms of grief, I think we can all kind of admit that our Western culture is pretty good at living. We've kind of figured that out. And we are a bit of a mess around the end of life. I feel like ours is a culture that doesn't know really how to honor grief. We understand it, we know we do grieve, at least openly. So I wonder what we might do better in the United States or Western culture to acknowledge that it's there, to admit that we have it, to support each other, to normalize it. Is it having conversations? I mean, is that where it starts, do you think?
I think so. The thing I've learned being the woman who wrote about death, which means now everybody wants to talk to me about death, is that everybody wants to talk about death. And so I think it's this kind of badly kept secret that we're all avoiding it because in Western society, it's the same in Australia, it's been considered taboo. And so we've all developed this aversion, which is ridiculous when you think about it, because it's the one sure thing that's going to happen to us. And I think what makes it so painful, it's never not going to be painful, but what makes it so painful is that we haven't talked about it until it happens and everybody is thrown into disarray. That's when the regrets come up. That's when people left behind don't know what wishes were. So I think literally just having a conversation with a loved one, talking about it more often. And I think if I could have one thing happen with this book, that people would have one conversation with a loved one about it, I think that could really change things. It's small change, but I think it is happening with the death positive movement. People, there's a lot of death cafes. There's, the fact that this book has been widely read is really gratifying to know that people are open to those conversations. So I think we just have to be brave.
Right. Be brave. I became aware kind of the death positive movement in around 2017, along with death cafes and the end of life doulas. I kind of started to become aware of those. Powerful books were being written about mortality and the sort of medical community's involvement in how we die. And so this was happening, and then all of a sudden, you could find these conversations if you wanted to. Not everybody was aware that there was such a thing. But then all of a sudden, this sort of threat of death comes front and center into our living rooms. We watch as this global pandemic spreads around the world. And so then we're very confronted and afraid. This was a really scary time. And I understand that you were in New York at that time, unable to go home to Australia. Were you working on this story during the pandemic?
I was.
Yeah.
It had just been an idea rolling around in my head, and because I hadn't planned to write fiction, I just ignored it. And then it was March 2020, and Australia essentially closed its borders, and there were flights home, but there were a lot of people who needed those flights home to be with loved ones who were dying or were sick themselves. And so I stayed in New York, and I was living by myself, and so it was just me in my apartment, but it was also when we were an epicenter of the pandemic. And I think for some reason my street is a throughway for ambulances, and so it was just, for weeks, it was all day and all night, just ambulances. And I could also see outside my bedroom window a nursing home, and I was just watching people getting stretchered off into ambulance. Like, it was just so confronting. And because almost everyone I knew had left New York, I would, ride a bike around and the streets would be empty, but I'd ride past the hospitals and there'd be the morgue trucks. And so it was really hard to avoid. And I thought, well, I have all this time and the world is going to be talking more about death, so maybe I can contribute something that can help people process it. So.
Well, I commend you for writing a positive book about death with that backdrop. It was a little bit hard to be positive during that time. Did it affect how you thought about your characters or how you thought about the story at all? Or were you just pretty much settled in at that point to, kind of what you were working on?
I think initially I hadn't focused as much on the grief angle. And then as it progressed and there was a lot of media about the grief and just observing people I knew who were going through that, I thought about how important it was to address that, how to be with someone who's grieving, the whole fact that they say that medically, if you're still grieving after 6 months, it's chronic grief, kind of acknowledging those things and questioning them, because there were going to be a lot of people who, in addition to the normal amount of people grieving, there were going to be even more.
Mm-hmm. Well, one theme of many that I appreciate throughout the story of Clover, in addition to what we've been talking about, I noticed this theme of vulnerability. We see Clover in the cocoon of her grandfather's apartment, surrounded by his things, wrapped up sometimes literally in a blanket on her couch with her animals. And I found it kind of compelling in one of the scenes with Claudia. Claudia was talking about photography and how engaging with people helps them become more vulnerable. And Clover's thought response, she wondered what it would be like to feel seen. And she thinks about how she tucks away her emotions so that her clients can be seen and understood, never really allowing herself to be seen in that way. So you bring in characters into her path that seem to kind of tap on her walls a bit. As you mentioned, Leo, who loves her but ribs her about spending so much time alone. Sebastian is a bit of a departure for her, and she resists, but he leads to work. So kind of in her mind, that's okay. And then Sylvie, kind of this whirl of energy, and if she had a tail, I bet it would be wagging constantly. So I was curious kind of what the process was of determining that these were the right personality types to bring her out, because they're all quite different from each other. How did that process kind of come together for you?
That's a good question. With Sylvie, that I learned, having moved around a lot. And I would say I'm an ambivert, so in between introvert and extrovert. But, when I move to a new place, I'm relatively shy. And every single place, I'd always end up meeting this friend who was really outgoing and would take me under their wing. And basically, that's how I would grow a friendship. And actually, when I was 17, I was a foreign exchange student in Lincoln, Nebraska, and which was a great year. But a friend I met, we were just partnered together in cooking class, and to this day we're still best friends. So, and she was the one who really, starting a new high school in America was very intimidating, and she really took me under her wing. So I think that happens a lot. There's this balance in the world that these extroverted people are here to balance out the introverts and vice versa. With Claudia, I think that was essential in my mind, because Clover never really got to have a maternal figure or an example of what it means to be an independent woman, who really seizes life. And so I really wanted her to have that example. And then Leo, I think, maybe kind of a tough love kind of thing, I think. Showing, that was kind of what I was speaking about earlier, that there are always these people around us, but we might not notice them. And they're really, some of that tough love and that nudging is really what we need, even if it is very uncomfortable at the time.
I thought it was so interesting too, and so much like real life, that there was a Sebastian. So it's almost like she got to kind of practice like a little bit in that relationship, like what would it be like? And as a reader, I think we feel like, oh, this is going somewhere. But like it often happens in life, you put yourself out there a little bit and you're interested, and then there's a red flag, and then there's another red flag, and you're like, ah.
Yeah.
So we really see that process unfold in such a natural and believable way. And then Hugo. And then we go, oh, okay. Hugo, like he's probably the one. So I was just curious if you were tempted to have Sebastian be the love interest, and kind of what led you down the road with Sebastian, and then to ultimately find out this is going to be a relationship, but more like a friendship. It's going to be what it's going to be.
Yeah. No, he was always not the love interest.
He was never
but I
gonna
really
be,
wanted
okay.
the reader to be like, this is a terrible book. Like, why? He's not a good love interest. She doesn't know what she's doing. What is this? And then do the switch at the end. Right. And I will say that he was worse in the beginning, and then the editors made me dial it back. So if you think he's bad now, you should have seen him what he was like. But what I really wanted to show with that was, Clover's only reference to romance are these movies she watches and the neighbours she spies on. And with the romantic comedies, that is a very unrealistic representation of romance. And now as I watch the ones I loved when I was younger, watching them as an adult, I'm like, oh, this is a very toxic relationship and clearly wasn't going to work after the credits rolled. And I think it is unrealistic to, especially with someone who's never found love and then they find love and then it's all great. And I really wanted to show that the first person you meet might not be the right person, and that's okay. And I do think what I wanted to show was that even though Sebastian wasn't right for her, if she hadn't met him before meeting Hugo, I don't think she would have been open enough to be with Hugo, because she is emotionally immature, because she just doesn't have any experience. And also dating is hard. Sebastian is an amalgamation of several people I've dated. And so I kind of wanted to acknowledge that, but still give her, not necessarily, like, we don't know if they did live happily ever after, but they at least get to see what happens.
Right. And then Claudia. Many readers that I've talked to, including my 93-year-old mother, who loved your book so much, resonated with the character of Claudia. And Claudia is the older, as you say, kind of mother figure and a sage voice in the story, who seems like she reflects qualities of Clover. They do have some commonalities. But she has this advantage of years of wisdom. So I was curious also about Claudia. Is she, a bit of a mixture of people that you know, or based on any particular person in your life, or just a kind of that quintessential sort of mother figure, who has a lot to share at the end of her life?
My brother and I were raised by a single mother in Tasmania, and part of that was, our family is from Tasmania, so we were raised by a village, and that included a lot of great aunts and uncles and grandparents, and they were really important in shaping my perspective. But now reflecting on it, I was very lucky because all of the women, they were born in, I guess, like the 1920s and 30s, but they were always traveling the world, were running their own businesses, were running farms, and so that was such a great example for me, because I was like, oh, well, this is what it means to be a woman in the world. And I've also done a lot of volunteering with the elderly, and just really listening to their stories and their regrets and things like that. So Leo and Claudia are kind of amalgamations of those people. Clover was actually one of my great aunts. That's where the name is from.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so sweet.
And she was probably the most cheeky and adventurous. So I do think when my family read it and her kids read it, they could see her spirit in there.
That's so sweet. And speaking of regret and Claudia, and I can't imagine in a way being at the very end of a long, lovely life, and knowing that you missed the one true love, and admitting that. But it also seemed like she had a faith of some kind, in that either they would meet again in another life or the next life, or at least that faith that a decision maybe is a decision. Mm-hmm. Maybe it doesn't have to be right or wrong or good or bad. I think when we speak about regret, we make a mistake, and then regret seems to be kind of an emotional reaction to that mistake. And I wonder if it's really those emotions that we attach that are kind of within our control. So I see kind of Claudia as someone who is working through that. She obviously is working through that regret. But would you say that maybe we don't really need to regret our regrets? It's kind of that part of that's up to us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think a lot of people think I'm anti-regret, but it's actually not the case. I think regrets are really important because that's how we learn and grow. Without friction, you know, you don't have to rethink things, or we learn from our mistakes. So I think regrets are a great thing because that's what makes us better people. But the thing is, we don't like to look at our regrets and consider them until the very end when it's too late to do anything. And I think in some cases it's going to be too late anyway. But what I would hope people might do is think, okay, if I were to die soon, what would my regrets be? And is there a small step I could take now to maybe have less of a regret? And when I was researching, you know, the things that people regretted on their deathbed, I was so surprised at how simple they were. They were just, you know, I wish I'd said I loved you more. I wish I'd worked less. I wish I'd, you know, painted or learnt French. It's not something like I wish I became a famous actor or anything like. They're very small things that you could take a step towards. And I think we just are so busy and so future thinking, but don't think about that moment. But to your point about Claudia, I think the people, you know, with her kind of being at peace that she made that decision, it is true that we do glamorize the path we don't take and think, oh, well, it would have been way better if I'd made that decision, but you don't know that.
Right.
And maybe that Hugo wasn't the right guy for her, but because they had these 3 weeks on a boat.
Yeah.
I mean, and when you've been thinking about that for 60 years, I think, you know, it's probably gotten better and better. And so who knows? Maybe it was a good thing. And then to kind of give her that a little bit of closure at the end, I think I wanted to make the point that, yes, it's good to address regrets, but sometimes you don't know if that choice you made was the wrong one.
Right. They might not have been great in real life off the boat, you know.
Yep, exactly.
Recently I found a stack of letters that my mother wrote to my father when she was in college. And I thought I had found a treasure. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I was just a stack. My dad had put it in a safe in the basement. And he passed, and I found them later. I'm like, oh, Mom, she's gonna be so excited to see these. And she looked at them and she said, yeah, they're not that great. Like, huh. What she was saying or thinking is that they're not full of vivid prose and love, and it were about very mundane things. So in her mind, she's like, don't expect a whole lot, but that was the beauty of them, is that letters represent a time and a place. I went to class, I went to math, I did this, I knitted you some socks, which she did. But they're also, letters are put in an envelope and sealed and sent to one recipient. They're very intimate, and it's almost like they are kind of relics from the past. So I loved that there were letters. There were letters that really brought Claudia kind of back to that time. And I think too, like, this handwritten letters just feel like gold. You know, we do email a lot, but letters aren't delivered by big tech, right? They're something real, much more personal. And I guess, where did sort of the idea of the letters come from? I know that's pretty easy to kind of imagine that Hugo, the grandson, would hang on to these, but any thoughts about kind of like how the letters came to be?
Yeah, I mean, I come from a big letter writing family. I think I always had to write thank you notes when I was a kid, and I still do write letters and thank you notes, because to me there is that meaning. It's the energy, it's the choosing of the paper, the writing neatly, the walking to the post office, getting a stamp, posting it. There's a lot of energy in mailing a letter, and I think, and it's such a delight when you get a letter, especially these days, because
Isn't it?
you don't, aside from bad letters like or bills, we
Right.
don't get many. So I think it's such, and I like to send them without someone expecting them, because I think that's such a pleasant surprise. And with the book, I mean, I did think about it because I know letters are kind of a trope in books, and it's a very easy way to fix something. But given the age of these people when they lived, letter writing would have been their main form of communication, especially living on 2 different continents. So I thought I would give it, and I think I just love finding those old letters of I found some of from my grandmother, my great-great-great-grandfather. It wasn't a letter, but he kept a diary, but all it was one line of what happened today. And it's just like the apple tree fell down, thunderstorm. But
It's kind of
it's
gold.
really evocative. And, I know nothing about my great-great-grandfather, but now I've lived these days in his life, and it was kind of amazing. And I think I do wonder in future generations, I know people can read your email once you're gone, but it's not the same thing as finding a letter, a tear-stained letter even, or just something. I think that's such a treasure for future generations, and I hope that we don't lose that.
Definitely. Do you, when you're, other than letter writing, do you write by hand instead of kind of typing? I'm just curious, as part of your writing process, do you write by hand? Do you journal, or are you pretty much?
I do journal. I don't write by hand. I think it's because I'm a minimalist, and I also don't like wasting paper. So I do most things on the computer, but there's just some things that I think writing something that someone can keep is really, there was a while there that I avoided writing cards because I was like, oh, the trees. But then I thought, well, if this is going to bring someone joy, then maybe I can stomach that that loss of trees.
Right, they're already made.
Yeah,
Cards are
exactly.
already made. So as the characters in Clover's world nudge her to take risks, Claudia's last words, which are really pretty precious, don't let the best parts of life pass you by because you're too scared of the unknown. Be cautiously reckless. Did taking on the writing of a novel fall into that category for you because it was new, something new? I'm curious what that and also what gifts might that process have given you?
I was very lucky that when I was a young journalist in my early 20s, I got the chance to interview Jane Birkin, which was amazing, and she gave me that piece of advice to be cautiously reckless, and it was such a gift to receive that in your early 20s. And a lot of people are like, well, what does that mean? It's kind of like an oxymoron, but to me it means taking calculated risks and being prepared and being informed, but when the time comes, trusting and being willing to take that leap. And so that's how I've always lived my life since then. And everyone's like, how can you take so many chances? And I always say it's not, I'm not just blindly jumping into things, moving to new countries and things like that. But I like that. I don't want to get to the end of my life and go, I wish I had taken that leap. And I think it's really, my great aunt Clover, I think she stole it from Mark Twain, but she used to say, it's not the things you do in life that you regret, it's the things you don't do. And she's been saying that since I think I could understand. So I think that was really present for me. And, why not try? Why not take the leap? But also don't be stupid about it.
Well, we are certainly grateful that you took the leap. Your book has given us all quite a lot to think about and talk about, and we so appreciate you being here with us. And as we kind of close the portion of the evening, I was wondering if you would mind reading a little bit for us.
Sure.
The epilogue of your book. You so thoughtfully capture through the story timing and tragedy and birth and death and how missed opportunities lead to new ones, kind of flirting with the idea that while we all make choices that take us in each direction, there's this bigger, broader force out there that we call fate. And Clover expresses that idea of fate so beautifully at the end. So if you would mind reading that for us.
Of course. The scent of sun-baked eucalyptus mingled with the salty breeze as I stood on the cliffs of Bonifacio, Corsica. The delicate stillness was far from the urban din I'd grown up with. Leaves brushed softly against one another as if in a loving caress. A bird called out to the vanishing sun, bidding it farewell for another day. The ripples of the Mediterranean washed gently onto the rocks, carrying with them the sparkle of dying sunlight. In the air below the cliffs, two distinct clouds of ashes danced together before descending gracefully into the sea. Claudia and her great love were reunited at last. Beside me, Hugo squeezed my hand, the golden glow from the horizon reflected in the traces of tears on his face. I squeezed back and watched as the last of the ashes disappeared into the water. In the distance, a small sailboat eased its way out to sea. I imagined Claudia sitting on its bow, happy to finally be where she belonged. But while the vision was heartwarming, it also felt bittersweet. If Claudia and Hugo had reunited, the Hugo next to me wouldn't exist. I wouldn't have spent the past 3 months traveling the world, documenting my adventures in my notebook that I couldn't wait to share with him. And I wouldn't be standing here on this French island, about to return home to New York to begin my photography studies. Their fate had somehow determined mine. People who were complete strangers to me less than a year ago had forever shifted the trajectory of my life. The fact that all of us were entangled, that everyone on the planet somehow shaped the course of one another's lives, often without realizing it, felt like almost too much for me to comprehend. But perhaps that's the point. Do we actually need to understand the world and all its patterns? You can find meaning in anything if you look hard enough, if you want to believe that everything happens for a reason. But if we completely understood one another, if every event made sense, none of us would ever learn or grow. Our days might be pleasant, but prosaic. So maybe we just need to appreciate that many aspects of life and the people we love will always be a mystery. Because without mystery, there is no magic. And instead of constantly asking ourselves the question of why we're here, maybe we should be savoring a simpler truth. We are here.
Mikki Brammer. Thank you so much. Well, I think now we're going to move on to the audience question portion of the evening. There will be microphones, one microphone, two microphones walking around. We probably won't have a chance to get to everybody's question, but ladies, take it away.
Okay, I saw this one first.
Hi, Ms. Brammer. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Oh.
Your book kicked my butt. My son died of COVID in December of 2021. The first year, you're numb. The second year is hard. Third is absolute hell. And Clover talked to me. I called friends, I called family because I was isolating. I was crying. I didn't want to look at anybody. I went to a grief group. I'd gone to the Death Cafe. But I was so mad at the whole damn world and seeing people in families. How dare you? I have my son's ashes. When I read your book, I started laughing and crying, and I thought you were writing to me, just to me. And I am so grateful because you got me out of that apartment. I joined a drumming circle. I came here. I am alive. I felt guilty being alive. My son was only 52. It was hell watching him die. I still can't believe he's gone. The last time I saw him was leaving the library. But I talked to him, and there's a communication like I've never had. I get answers. I looked at his picture and I said, I want a guardian angel statue this big. I'm still your ma. Find it. I came back to the library 2 weeks later. It was sitting where you return the books.
Wow.
2 inches. You brought me back to life.
Aw,
I
thank
can't
you for
thank
that.
you enough.
Very sweet.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. That's so beautiful. I'm so sorry that you've gone through that heartbreak, but that it just sounds so special, the path you've been on, and I'm so privileged to have played a tiny part in that.
I really enjoyed your book, and I like your writing style. I was just wondering, are you planning a second book?
Yes, I'm working on it at the moment. I can't say too much about it. I will say there's much less death, but the normal amount of death. And I would also say similar existential themes, but like life affirming, but it's different from Clover.
Danielle, I'm doing all the hard work.
I'm so sorry. Raise your hand over here. Come on. Peer pressure. I'm just wondering if in writing this book, you were jump-started into doing something you didn't want to regret not doing at some point in your life.
Yes, it really helped me get to the bottom of where my fear came from. And what I realized was it wasn't a fear of my own death, it was a fear of losing my loved ones. And I thought, well, I'm quite lucky that I've realized this now because I can take action. And so it was specifically my mum, who I'm very close to. And so I thought, well, from what I've learned, what are the things that people really regret when they lose someone? And it's not having said the things they wanted to say, ask them the questions, not having a recording of their voice or a sample of their writing. And so my mum and I speak every week on Skype. She's in Tasmania. And I said to her one day, you know, what if we just made a rule that we can ask each other any question we've ever wanted to ask? And my mum is very open, so she's like, sure. And I said, and also I want to record it. And she was like, all right. And so she didn't actually ask me that many questions, but I asked every question I've always wondered about her. And I really tried to make sure that I was speaking to her as a human being and not as my mother, and seeing her as a completely different person separate from my existence. And so I asked her about, she lost her mum when she was 13. I asked her about her divorce, you know, her challenges, what it was like being a single mum, everything. And she told me, and I have all of those recordings. And then I just decided, well, I've got all of those very kind of profound things recorded, but it's also nice just to hear her speak about what's in her garden or what she's knitting. And, you know, I might find them a bit mundane in the moment, but when she's gone, they're going to be so special to be able to sit and listen to my mum talk about her garden. And so we have that with her, but also she loves weaving, and so I made sure to get a video of her weaving and asking her what she loves about weaving and seeing someone in their element. I think there's actually research that you fall in love with, this is more romantic, but you fall in love with someone more when you see them in their element doing something they love. And so to be able to capture someone you love doing that, I think is really special. And so aside from that, it's really made me be very present in all of my relationships, friendships, romantic, everything. And just, I think our society moves so fast now that we're always thinking about the next thing, and we just access so much knowledge. And so when I'm at an event like this or I'm at a dinner with friends, I try to really sit and say to myself, you know, I am here and this is amazing, and I'll never get to experience this very moment again, and so I'm going to savor it. And I think just always making sure I don't leave things unsaid, whether it's just an appreciation of someone or even the opposite, you know, if something's bothering me, instead of keeping it inside and letting it fester, I try to say it, and usually is fine, you know, because you just talk it out, and if it's someone you care about, then they're usually willing to talk about it. So it's very much changed my life, and I don't have the fear that I used to, which is great.
I've got it.
Wow. He's running. Yes, she is.
Thank you. I loved your book as well. Regrets, Advice, and Confessions were the three books that Clover would enter her notes into at the experience of each death that she wrote. What was the inspiration that created those books? And would you give us a regret, some advice, and a confession
Yes.
regarding the book?
Okay. Yes. The three notebooks came from when I was really looking into what people say on their deathbed. It did really seem that they would generally fit into these categories. Sometimes they didn't, you know, sometimes people just said nonsensical things and, you know, or just random words. But as a general rule, you could kind of categorize them that way. Which I found fascinating, and again, saying some of them, like the confessions some of them were sensational, and it was surprising how many people ask for divorces on their deathbed. They just say, I'm not leaving this world attached to that person. But I mean, I kind of included my own things in there. So, well, the whole book is basically my advice. You know, I packed in all the wisdom I could, but the wearing sunscreen especially is important. My regret, I didn't eat mangoes until I was 30. And I lived in a part of Australia where I went to college is in the tropical part where there's the most amazing mangoes, and I avoided them the whole time. And then just as I was about to move away from Australia to France, I tried a mango and I was like, wait, what? And loved them. And now, no offense, but American mangoes or the ones you get in the supermarket here aren't always great.
We know.
Yeah. And so I often just sit and have a montage of all the uneaten mangoes in my life. And then, this isn't in the book, but my confession is that I have a terrible sense of direction, but I also seem to have a demeanor that makes people ask me for direction. And as I mentioned, I've lived in big cities and people always come up to me, and I used to be quite a people pleaser, and so I didn't want to disappoint them. And so I would tell people the way I thought it was. And then, I mean, here's an example of my bad direction. When I come out of the subway in New York, now I know it, but when I first moved there, I would always think, which way do I think it is? And go the opposite direction because I was always wrong. And so it turns out I was sending all these tourists the wrong way in all these countries. And I didn't realize it till afterwards. And so I often think about that, actually, all the people that I wish I could just do a bulk apology for everyone who's ever asked me for directions. So now I don't do it. I only tell them if I'm 100% sure.
All right, up front.
Anyways, thank you very much for this book. You know, it actually came at an interesting time for me because I'm actually going through something right now with a family member who's listening to how and reading how Clover interacted with Claudia is really helping. So that's a great thing. But I'm also interested in just the process. When you wrote this, did you come up with a story and this is how you want it to go, or did you come up with the characters and say, hey, these are the people that I want to interact with each other, and then put them in the story? And was there any time when you were writing this all of a sudden you surprised yourself? You're like, oh, they're going to do this, and this is how it's going to happen.
Yeah, no, I did it with the characters first, and then it was actually because I'd never written a book before, and I started with the idea of a death doula, and she has 3 notebooks. And then I was like, oh, what is she going to do for 90,000 words? And And that's when I was like, well, there needs to be other people. And that's when I kind of thought it through. And so it was more, I thought about the things I wanted to convey about what we've spoken about, relationships, grief, loneliness, and things like that. And just present everything I'd learned about these topics, as I said, in a more palatable way. But it did surprise me, you know, I didn't outline it or anything. I knew where I wanted it to end, which was helpful, but I think I knew the key parts, like that Sebastian wasn't the one, that Leo would die, and then obviously Claudia was going to die. But that was the framework, and then I just filled it in. It was like a puzzle.
Nope, there's one up front here.
I don't really have a question. I just have a comment. I have been a hospice chaplain for going on 32 years.
Wow.
And there have been, well, and I said this when they brought this book forth as the One Book, One Village. There have been very few things I have read that have spoken so deeply to what we do on a daily basis. And when I tell people what I do, the first thing they say is, oh, that must be so hard. Oh, how sad. How can you go on with being so sad? And while it is sad, it is so life-affirming also, not just for me, but to share all parts of life with other people and to get down to the meat and bones of what life is about. It's not about the journey, but it's about sharing life together and finding our way and messing up and figuring things out maybe for a moment. And I just wanted to thank you for this book, for all that it meant to me and how it spoke to me in what I've done and what I've given my life to doing. It just, you nailed it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a true honor to hear from someone like you, and thank you. I just think, as I said, people like you are so noble, and we're so lucky to have you.
We have time for one last question.
There's one up front.
All right.
Thank you. There was so much in this book. It felt like because you were a journalist or wrote shorter articles, you packed a lot in few words sometimes. But it also felt a little bit like a movie, and I'm just wondering if that is in the future book.
Thank you. Yes, there have been conversations, nothing concrete, but we'll see. That was infuriatingly vague, I'm sorry.
So, Mikki, as just a little tiny token of thank you, I feel like you've encouraged all of us to take our own little adventures in our lives, maybe big ones, maybe small ones, and just taking a risk can be an adventure. So I wanted to get you an adventure journal.
Oh, thank you so much.
On behalf of all of us, thank you so much.
That is such a treasure. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for such wonderful questions, for doing this, for leading the Death Cafes. I've really enjoyed this. And thank you to everyone who came. I know there's so many excellent books in the world and not enough time to read them. So the fact that you would spend time and energy reading mine is so meaningful, and that you would come here to listen. I just truly appreciate it. And to the Arlington Heights Memorial Library, I'm so honored that you've picked my book for the One Book, One Village. I was just, the support and the thought and the energy and just the care that the whole team has put into this and all of the events is just mind-blowing, and I'm so honored to be here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mikki.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to Mikki and Rebecca for joining us for this amazing conversation on the collected regrets of Clover. We want to thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring this event, Liliana Wasco for the beautiful cello music at the beginning of the event, Willow House for their community partnership, and the Bookstall for joining us and making the book signing possible. Mikki is going to take a very short break after which she will sign copies of the Collected Regrets of Clover. If you plan on staying for the signing, please stay in your seat for now. If you are not staying for the signing, thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful evening.
And Mikki, real quick, did you want to take a
yes.
quick
Do you mind?
picture?
I wanted to take a photo of the audience, if that's okay. Thank you.